Welcome to Midnight Echoes. Tonight, as the rain falls gently outside your window, I want to share with you 7 stories that will make you question every shadow in your room. These are tales of ordinary people who encountered the extraordinary in the quiet hours of the night. So settle in, close your eyes, and let the echoes of midnight guide you into the darkness. Our first story takes us to Mercy General Hospital, where a night shift nurse discovered that some patients never really leave. Story 1, the night shift. It was 2:47 a.m. when Sarah first heard the crying. She had been working the night shift at Mercy General Hospital for 3 years, and she thought she had seen everything. The emergency room was quiet that Tuesday night, unusually quiet. The kind of silence that makes every small sound echo through empty corridors, like whispers from another world. Sarah was updating patient charts when she heard it. A soft sobbing coming from room 237. But room 237 had been empty for 2 weeks, ever since Mrs. Henderson passed away. Mrs. Henderson had been Sarah's favorite patient. An 82-year-old woman with kind eyes and stories that could fill a library. She had been admitted for what should have been routine surgery, but complications arose. Sarah had held her hand during those final moments, promising her that she wouldn't be alone. "I don't want to leave," Mrs. Henderson had whispered. "This place feels like home now." Those were her last words. Now, 2 weeks later, Sarah stood frozen outside room 237, her hand trembling on the door handle. The crying had stopped, but she could hear something else. The faint sound of someone humming. It was a lullaby Mrs. Henderson used to hum while Sarah checked her vitals. Sarah's training told her to call security. Her heart told her to run. But something deeper, something she couldn't explain, made her push open that door. The room was empty. The bed was stripped bare, just as it had been for 2 weeks. But the temperature was ice cold. Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs as she stepped inside. That's when she saw it. On the bedside table sat a single white rose, the same type Mrs. Henderson's daughter had brought every day during her stay. But the daughter lived 3 states away now, and no one had been in this room since the cleaning crew finished 2 weeks ago. Sarah reached for the rose with shaking fingers. The moment she touched it, the humming started again, louder this time. And it wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from behind her. She turned around slowly, her heart pounding so hard. She was sure it would wake the entire hospital. Standing in the doorway was the silhouette of an elderly woman in a hospital gown. The figure raised one translucent hand and waved, just like Mrs. Henderson used to do every morning when Sarah started her shift. "Thank you," came a whisper, soft as the rain outside. for keeping your promise." And then she was gone. Sarah stood there for what felt like hours. But when she finally looked at her watch, only 30 seconds had passed. The rose in her hand had wilted completely, its petals falling to the floor like tears. She never told anyone what happened that night. But from then on, whenever she worked the night shift, she would always stop by room 237. Sometimes she would find small things. A flower, a handwritten note saying thank you, or the faint scent of the lavender perfume Mrs. Henderson always wore. The other nurses began to notice that room 237 was different. Patients who stayed there recovered faster. Families found comfort they couldn't explain. And sometimes, late at night, the cleaning staff would report hearing gentle humming coming from the empty room. Sarah still works at Mercy General. She has been promoted to head nurse now, but she always volunteers for the night shift because she knows that some promises transcend death, and some patients never really leave the place where they found peace. Story 2. The Lighthouse Keeper's Secret. Our second tale takes us to the rocky coast of Maine, where lighthouse keeper Thomas Whitmore discovered that some lights are meant to guide more than just ships to safety. Thomas had been the keeper of Beacon Point Lighthouse for 15 years. It was a solitary job, perfect for a man who preferred the company of seabirds to people. Every night, he would climb the 137 steps to the top of the lighthouse and ensure the beacon was burning bright, guiding ships safely through the treacherous waters. But there was something Thomas had never told anyone. Something that happened every night at exactly 3:15 a.m. It started 3 months after he first took the job. Thomas was performing his routine maintenance check when he heard footsteps on the metal stairs below him. Heavy boots, climbing slowly but deliberately toward the lamp room where he worked. Thomas called out, thinking perhaps a fisherman had sought shelter from a storm. But there was no answer. The footsteps continued, growing closer with each echoing clang against the metal steps. When Thomas peered down the spiral staircase, he saw nothing. The lighthouse was empty, just as it had been when he locked the door hours earlier. But the footsteps continued. Now just one flight below him. That's when Thomas noticed something that made his blood run cold. The footsteps were wet. With each step, he could hear the squelch of waterlogged boots, and small puddles of seawater were appearing on each step, as if someone soaking wet was climbing toward him. Thomas grabbed his flashlight and shone it down the stairwell. The beam illuminated the wet footprints clearly now, but there was no one making them. The invisible presence continued climbing, leaving a trail of seawater and the smell of salt and decay. When the footsteps reached the lamp room, Thomas felt the temperature drop 20 degrees. His breath came out in clouds, and frost began forming on the lighthouse lens. Then, In the reflection of the great lens, Thomas saw him. A man in a heavy coat and captain's hat, his face pale and bloated, seaweed hanging from his beard. Water dripped constantly from his clothes, forming puddles on the floor. The man's eyes were clouded white, like those of a fish that had been dead for days. The ghostly figure pointed toward the ocean, then vanished. Thomas stood frozen for several minutes before he understood. He rushed to the lighthouse log and began reading entries from previous keepers. What he found made his hands shake. 15 years earlier, Captain Marcus Reed had been caught in a sudden storm while bringing his fishing vessel back to port. The lighthouse beacon had failed that night due to a mechanical problem, and Captain Reed's ship had crashed against the rocks below. All hands were lost. The lighthouse records showed that Captain Reed's body was never recovered. The Coast Guard had searched for weeks, but the ocean had claimed him completely. From that night forward, Thomas made sure to check the lighthouse beacon twice every evening. Because he realized that Captain Reed wasn't haunting the lighthouse out of malice. He was trying to ensure that no other ships would suffer the same fate as his own. The wet footsteps continued every night at 3:15 a.m. for the rest of Thomas's career. But the lighthouse never failed again. Not once in 15 years. And whenever storms threatened the coast, fishermen would report seeing an extra bright glow from Beacon Point. As if someone was making absolutely certain the light would guide them home safely. When Thomas finally retired, he left detailed instructions for his replacement about the nightly visitor. He wrote in his final log entry, "Captain Reed keeps watch with us. Let him do his duty, and he will help you do yours." Some guardians never abandon their post, even in death. The new lighthouse keeper reported that the footsteps stopped after Thomas left. But on stormy nights, when the waves crash highest against the rocks, fishermen still say they can see two figures in the lamp room of Beacon Point Lighthouse. One living, one dead. Both dedicated to guiding souls safely through the darkness. Story 3. The Music Box, Ballerina. Our third story tonight comes from a small antique shop in Salem, Massachusetts, where shop owner Eleanor Hartwell learned that some melodies carry memories that refuse to fade. Eleanor had inherited Hartwell antiques from her grandmother, along with a strict rule: never sell the music box with the porcelain ballerina. That sat on the shelf behind the counter. Her grandmother had been adamant about this, though she never explained why. That music box stays in the family. Her grandmother had said on her deathbed, "Promise me, Eleanor, no matter what anyone offers, it never leaves this shop." Eleanor had promised, though she never understood why. The music box was beautiful, certainly. Hand-carved mahogany with intricate silver inlays, and a delicate porcelain ballerina that spun gracefully when the melody played. It was easily the most valuable piece in the shop, and Eleanor had received numerous offers for it over the years. But a promise was a promise. The music box played a haunting melody, something Eleanor had never been able to identify. It was beautiful but melancholy, the kind of tune that made you think of lost love and forgotten dreams. The ballerina would spin slowly as the music played, her tiny painted face forever frozen in the expression of longing. Eleanor had owned the shop for 7 years when strange things began to happen. It started with the music box playing on its own. Eleanor would arrive in the morning to find it open, the ballerina spinning silently. Though the melody had long since wound down. At first, she assumed the mechanism was old and faulty. But then she began to notice other things. Items in the shop would be rearranged overnight. Nothing was ever stolen or damaged, but things would be moved. A Victorian mirror would be turned to face a different direction. A set of antique photographs would be arranged in a perfect circle. Fresh flowers would appear in vases that had been empty the night before. Eleanor installed security cameras, thinking perhaps someone had a key to the shop. But when she reviewed the footage, she saw something that made her question her own sanity. At exactly midnight every night, the music box would open by itself. The ballerina would begin to spin, though no melody played. And then, as clear as if she were standing right there, Eleanor could see a young woman dancing in the shop. She was beautiful, perhaps 20 years old, with long dark hair and wearing a flowing white dress that seemed to move with its own wind. The woman would dance through the shop, touching various items, rearranging them with purpose. She moved with the grace of a trained ballerina, her movements perfectly synchronized with the spinning porcelain figure in the music box. But the most unsettling part was the woman's face. She looked exactly like the porcelain ballerina, down to the same expression of eternal longing. Eleanor researched the music box's history and discovered a tragic story. In 1895, a young ballerina named Isabelle Moreau had been the star of the Boston Ballet Company. She was engaged to marry a wealthy merchant who had commissioned the music box as an engagement gift. The melody it played was from her favorite ballet, Giselle. But 3 days before their wedding, Isabelle was found dead in her dressing room at the theater. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but rumors persisted that she had been poisoned by a rival dancer who was jealous of Isabelle's success and engagement. The music box had been given to Isabelle's younger sister, who eventually moved to Salem and opened an antique shop. Eleanor's grandmother had purchased it from the sister's estate sale, along with a warning about its unusual properties. Armed with this knowledge, Eleanor decided to communicate with Isabelle. The next night, she stayed in the shop and waited for midnight. When the music box opened and the ghostly ballerina appeared, Eleanor spoke softly. "Isabelle, I know who you are. I know what happened to you. The dancing figure stopped and turned toward Eleanor. For the first time, the expression on her face changed from longing to hope. "You were murdered," Eleanor continued. "Someone poisoned you because they were jealous of your talent and your happiness." Isabel nodded slowly, then pointed to the music box. She began to dance again, but this time her movements told a story. She mimed drinking something, then clutched her throat and fell to the floor. She pointed to an invisible figure, someone who had given her the fatal drink. Eleanor understood. "You want justice. You want people to know the truth." Isabel smiled for the first time, and the expression transformed her face from tragic to radiant. Eleanor spent the next several weeks researching Isabel's death. She contacted historians, searched newspaper archives, and even hired a genealogist to trace the families of the other dancers from the Boston Ballet Company. What she discovered was remarkable. The rival dancer who had likely poisoned Isabel had gone on to have a successful career, eventually becoming the director of a prestigious dance academy. She had lived a long, celebrated life, while Isabel's name had been largely forgotten. Eleanor wrote a detailed article about Isabel's life and suspicious death, which was published in a historical journal. She also contacted the Boston Ballet Company, who agreed to dedicate their next performance of Giselle to Isabel's memory. The night after the dedication performance, Eleanor waited in the shop for midnight. When the music box opened, Isabel appeared one final time. But instead of the white dress, she wore a beautiful ballet costume, and instead of longing, her face showed peace. Isabel performed one last dance, a solo from Giselle that was breathtakingly beautiful. When she finished, she curtsied deeply to Eleanor, placed her hand over her heart in gratitude, and faded away like morning mist. The music box never opened by itself again. But sometimes, when Eleanor winds it up and lets the melody play, she swears she can see Isabel dancing in the reflection of the shop windows, finally free to perform for eternity in a place where her talent is remembered and celebrated. Eleanor still owns the antique shop, and the music box still sits on the shelf behind the counter. She has never broken her promise to her grandmother, but now she understands why the music box must stay in the family. Some stories need guardians, and some spirits need someone to remember their truth. Story 4. The Midnight Train. Our fourth tale brings us to the abandoned railway station in Millbrook, where station master Henry Collins discovered that some trains run on schedules that exist beyond time itself. Henry had been the night watchman at Millbrook Station for 8 years. Ever since the last passenger train had stopped running through the small mountain town, the station had been officially closed for a decade. But the railway company still needed someone to maintain the property and watch for vandals or copper thieves who might strip the old infrastructure. It was lonely work, but Henry didn't mind. He had his thermos of coffee, his collection of paperback novels, and the peaceful silence of the mountains. The old station was beautiful in its decay, with ornate Victorian architecture slowly being reclaimed by ivy and weather. But Henry's peaceful nights were disrupted when he began hearing the train. It always happened at exactly 11:47 p.m. Henry would hear the distant whistle first, echoing through the mountain valleys like a mournful cry. Then came the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails, growing steadily louder as the phantom locomotive approached the station. The first time it happened, Henry rushed outside, thinking perhaps a freight train was using the old tracks. But the rails were empty, rusted and overgrown with weeds. No train had passed through Millbrook in over 10 years, yet the sounds continued. The whistle, the wheels, the hiss of steam brakes as the invisible train came to a stop at the platform. Henry could even hear the doors opening with a pneumatic sigh, followed by the shuffle of footsteps as passengers disembarked. But there was nothing there, just empty tracks and the cold mountain air. Henry researched the station's history and discovered a tragedy that had been largely forgotten. On November 15th, 1943, the Millbrook Express had been carrying soldiers home on leave for Thanksgiving. The train was packed beyond capacity, with young men eager to see their families before shipping out to the Pacific Theater. But as the train rounded Devil's Curve, just 2 miles outside Millbrook Station, a rock slide caused by heavy rains had blocked the tracks. The engineer tried to stop, but the train was traveling too fast. The locomotive derailed, plunging into the ravine below. 47 soldiers died in the crash, along with the engineer, conductor, and 3 civilian passengers. The accident had been covered up by the military, who didn't want news of the tragedy to affect morale during the war. Families were told their sons had died in training accidents, and the wreckage was quietly removed. A new section of track was built around Devil's Curve, and life went on. But the dead, it seemed, were still trying to come home. Henry began timing the phantom train's arrival. 11:47 p.m. every night without fail, according to the old timetables he found in the station office. That was exactly when the Millbrook Express was scheduled to arrive on its final journey. One night, Henry decided to wait on the platform when the train arrived. As 11:47 approached, he stood where passengers would normally disembark, his heart pounding with anticipation and fear. The whistle sounded, closer than ever before. The clacking of wheels grew thunderous, And then, as the invisible train pulled into the station, Henry felt a rush of cold air wash over him, carrying the scent of coal smoke and something else. Something that reminded him of his grandfather's old army uniform, stored in mothballs for decades. The phantom doors opened with their familiar pneumatic hiss, and Henry watched in amazement as translucent figures began stepping onto the platform. Young men in military uniforms, their faces eager and hopeful. They carried duffel bags and wore the expressions of soldiers heading home to loved ones. But as each figure stepped onto the platform, their expressions changed. Confusion replaced joy as they looked around the abandoned station. Some called out names Asian. Some called out names, looking for family members who would never come. Others simply stood in bewildered silence, slowly realizing that something was terribly wrong. Henry approached one of the ghostly soldiers, a boy who couldn't have been more than 19. The young man looked up at Henry, with eyes full of questions. "Excuse me, sir. Is this Millbrook Station? I'm supposed to meet my mother here. She said she'd be waiting." Henry's throat tightened. "What's your name, son?" "Private James Morrison, sir. I'm on leave for Thanksgiving. My mother, she wrote and said she'd meet me at the station with my little sister. Have you seen them?" Henry had read the casualty list from the train crash. Private James Morrison, age 19, of Millbrook. Survived by his mother Margaret and sister Susan. "James, what year do you think it is?" "1943, sir. November 15th. Why do you ask?" Henry realized that these souls had been trapped in that moment for over 60 years, reliving their final journey home again and again, never understanding why their families weren't there to meet them. "James, I need to tell you something important. There was an accident. The train crashed before it reached the station. You and the other soldiers, you didn't make it home." The ghostly figure stared at Henry for a long moment, then looked around at his fellow passengers. Understanding slowly dawned on their faces. "We're dead, aren't we?" "I'm sorry, son. You've been trying to come home for 60 years. But you're already there. Your mother and sister, they're waiting for you on the other side. Will you tell them we tried to come home? Will you tell them we never forgot?" "I will." One by one, the ghostly soldiers began to fade, their faces peaceful now that they understood. James was the last to go. He saluted Henry, then smiled. "Thank you for helping us find our way home, sir." Then he was gone. The phantom train never returned to Millbrook Station. But Henry kept his promise. He researched each of the soldiers who had died in the crash. and contacted their surviving family members. Many had children and grandchildren who had never known the full story of how their fathers and grandfathers had died. Henry organized a memorial service at the station on the 60th anniversary of the crash. Families came from across the country to honor the soldiers who had tried so hard to come home. A plaque was installed on the platform, listing the names of all who had perished. That night, as Henry locked up the station after the ceremony, he heard the train whistle one last time, but this time it wasn't mournful. It sounded like a farewell, a final thank you carried on the mountain wind. Henry continued working at the station until his retirement, but he never heard the midnight train again. The soldiers had finally found their way home. Story 5. The Dollmaker's Daughter. Our fifth story takes us to the small town of Willowbrook, where toy shop owner Margaret Chen discovered that some childhood companions never truly leave us, even when we outgrow them. Margaret had inherited Chen's toy emporium from her elderly aunt, along with a workshop in the basement, where her aunt had crafted beautiful handmade dolls. The shop was filled with toys of every description, but the dolls were always the most popular items. Children would press their faces against the glass display cases, mesmerized by the lifelike faces and intricate clothing. But there was one doll that was never for sale. She sat on a high shelf behind the counter. A porcelain-faced girl with golden curls and a blue velvet dress. Her aunt had called her Lily, and she had been in the family for 3 generations.
Lily was my grandmother's masterpiece, her aunt had explained. She's not just a doll, Margaret. She's special. Promise me you'll take care of her.
Margaret had promised, though she found the doll somewhat unsettling. Lily's glass eyes seemed to follow her around the shop, and there was something almost too lifelike about her expression. But she kept her promise and made sure Lily remained safely on her shelf. The strange incidents began 3 months after Margaret took over the shop. She would arrive in the morning to find toys rearranged, as if children had been playing with them overnight. At first, she blamed mice or settling, but then she began to notice patterns. The toy tea set would be arranged for a party, with tiny cups and saucers set for 2. The dollhouse furniture would be rearranged, as if someone had been redecorating. Most disturbing of all, other dolls in the shop would be found sitting in a circle, as if they had been having a meeting. Margaret installed security cameras, but they revealed nothing unusual. Just empty rooms and motionless toys. But the rearrangements continued, becoming more elaborate each night. Then Margaret began to hear the laughter. It started as a faint giggle, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator in the back room. But gradually it grew clearer. The laughter of a young girl, delighted and innocent. It always came from the direction of Lily's shelf. One night, Margaret decided to stay late and see what was happening. She hid in the back room with a clear view of the main shop and waited. At exactly midnight, she heard the laughter again, clearer than ever before. And then she saw her. A little girl, perhaps 7 years old, with golden curls and wearing a blue velvet dress identical to Lily's. She was translucent, like moonlight given form. But her joy was unmistakably real. The ghostly child moved through the shop with obvious familiarity. Margaret watched in fascination as the spirit child held tea parties with the stuffed animals, built elaborate block towers, and carefully combed the hair of the other dolls. She played with the innocent wonder that only children possess, completely absorbed in her imaginary world. But what struck Margaret most was how lonely the child seemed. She would set up games for 2 players, then play both parts herself. She would have conversations with the toys, providing both sides of the dialogue. It was heartbreaking to watch. Margaret researched the doll's history and discovered a tragic story. In 1895, her great-great-grandmother had crafted Lily as a companion for her own daughter, Rose, who was dying of tuberculosis. Rose had been quarantined in her room for months, with only the doll for company. Rose had poured all her love and longing into that doll, treating her as a real friend and confidante. When Rose finally succumbed to the disease, she was found clutching Lily, whispering to her about all the games they would play in heaven. But Rose's spirit had never left. She had remained bound to the doll that had been her only comfort in her final days, playing eternal games in the toy shop that had become her playground. Margaret realized that Rose wasn't malicious or frightening. She was simply a lonely child who wanted someone to play with. The next night, Margaret stayed in the shop again, but this time she didn't hide. When Rose appeared at midnight, Margaret stepped forward gently. "Hello, Rose," she said softly. "I'm Margaret. I take care of the toy shop now." The ghostly child looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Are you here to play with me? No one ever wants to play anymore." Margaret's heart broke. "I would love to play with you, Rose. What would you like to play?" Rose's face lit up with joy. "Tea party. I'll get the good cups." For the next hour, Margaret sat on the floor of her toy shop, having an elaborate tea party with a ghost child who had been waiting over a century for someone to play with her. Rose chattered happily about her favorite games, her doll Lily, and how lonely she had been. "Everyone always leaves," Rose said sadly as she poured imaginary tea. "Mama and Papa left. The other children can't see me. Even the people who work in the shop, they're always too busy to play." "I can see you, Rose," Margaret said. and I promise I'll come play with you whenever you want. Rose's smile was radiant. Really? You promise? I promise. From that night forward, Margaret would stay late in the shop several times a week to play with Rose. They would have tea parties, play dress-up with the dolls, build elaborate cities with the blocks. Rose taught Margaret games from her era, while Margaret introduced her to modern toys. But Margaret also realized that Rose needed more than just playtime. She needed to understand that it was okay to move on, to join her family. Join her?
Break het zijn, dat ik uitvallen.
To join her family. Margaret said one night as they were putting away toys, "Do you ever think about your mama and papa? They must miss you very much." Rose nodded sadly. "I miss them too, but Lily needs me. She gets scared when she's alone." Margaret looked up at the doll on the shelf, understanding finally dawning. "Rose, what if I promised to take care of Lily? What if I promised she would never be alone?"
Rose considered this seriously. You would really take care of her? Forever and always?
"Forever and always," Margaret promised. Rose smiled and walked over to Margaret, taking her hand. For a moment, Margaret could feel the warmth of a real child's touch. "Thank you for playing with me," Rose whispered. "Thank you for being my friend." A soft golden light began to surround Rose, and Margaret could see two figures waiting in the distance. A man and woman with their arms outstretched, their faces filled with love and longing. "Mama, Papa," Rose cried out joyfully, running toward them. The three figures embraced, and then slowly faded into the light, leaving behind only the scent of roses and the echo of a child's laughter. Margaret kept her promise. She moved Lily to a place of honor in the shop window, where she could watch over all the children who came to play. And sometimes, when the afternoon sun hits the window just right, customers swear they can see a little girl in a blue dress, playing happily among the toys, finally at peace. Story 6. The Archivist's Discovery. Our sixth tale brings us to the basement archives of the Riverside Public Library, where head librarian David Walsh uncovered a book that contained more than just words on a page. David had been the head librarian at Riverside Public Library for 12 years, and he thought he knew every book in their collection. The library was over 100 years old, and its basement archives contained thousands of rare books, historical documents, and forgotten manuscripts that hadn't seen daylight in decades. It was during a routine cataloging project that David discovered the book. It was bound in deep red leather, with no title on the cover or spine. The pages were yellowed with age, and the text was written in an elegant script that seemed to shimmer slightly in the fluorescent light. The book appeared to be a journal, dated 1878, written by someone named Evelyn Blackwood. The entries described daily life in Riverside during the late 19th century, but there was something unsettling about the tone. Evelyn wrote about people and events with an intimacy that suggested she was watching them closely, perhaps too closely. David was intrigued by the historical value of the journal and began reading it during his lunch breaks. Evelyn's entries were fascinating, providing detailed accounts of the town's founding families, local scandals, and social events. But as David read deeper into the journal, he began to notice something strange. Evelyn wrote about people who were still alive today, not descendants or relatives, but the actual same people. She described Mrs. Patterson, who ran the flower shop on Main Street, attending a garden party in 1879. She wrote about Dr. Morrison, the town physician, treating patients for influenza in 1881. These were people David saw every day, people who should have been dead for over a century. At first, David assumed it was a coincidence. Perhaps the current residents had been named after their ancestors. But as he continued reading, the details became too specific to ignore. Evelyn described Mrs. Patterson's distinctive laugh, Dr. Morrison's habit of adjusting his glasses when he was thinking, and dozens of other personal quirks that matched the people David knew perfectly. Even more disturbing were Evelyn's predictions. She wrote about events that hadn't happened yet, describing them as if they were memories. She mentioned the Great Fire that would destroy the old courthouse in 1923, the flood that would devastate Main Street in 1957, and the construction of the new highway that would bypass the town in 1984. All of these events had happened exactly as Evelyn had described them. David began to research Evelyn Blackwood, but he could find no record of her existence. No birth certificate, no death certificate, no mention in any historical documents. It was as if she had never existed, yet her journal contained intimate knowledge of the town's entire history. As David continued reading, the entries became more personal. Evelyn began writing about him. "The new librarian is a curious man," she wrote in an entry dated the previous week. "He spends his lunch hours reading in the archives, searching for answers to questions he doesn't yet know how to ask. He has kind eyes like his father before him." David's blood ran cold. His father had been the previous head librarian, a position David had inherited after his father's sudden death from a heart attack 2 years earlier. But how could Evelyn know about his father? How could she be writing about events that were happening now? The entries about David became more frequent and more detailed. Evelyn described his daily routines, his thoughts, even his dreams. She wrote about his loneliness since his father's death, his dedication to preserving the town's history, and his secret fear that he was wasting his life in a job that no one appreciated. But she also wrote about things that hadn't happened yet. David will discover the truth about our town next Tuesday, she wrote. He will understand why some of us never leave, why some stories never end. He will have to choose whether to join us or try to escape. Tuesday was 3 days away. David considered destroying the journal, but something compelled him to keep reading. Evelyn's tone had changed from observational to almost pleading. She wrote about being trapped, about watching the same events play out over and over again, about people who lived the same lives repeatedly without ever aging or dying. Riverside is caught in a loop, she wrote, a moment in time that repeats endlessly. We are all prisoners here, playing out our roles again and again. Some of us remember like me. Others live each cycle as if it were the first time. The only way to break free is to make someone from outside understand the truth. David realized that Evelyn wasn't just observing the town's history. She was living it over and over again, trapped in an endless cycle that had been repeating for over a century. And now she was trying to use him to break free. On Tuesday morning, David arrived at the library early and went straight to the archives. The journal was open to one entry, written in fresh ink. Today is the day. You must choose, join us in the eternal cycle, or help us find our way to the end of the story. Look for me in the town square at noon. I'll be the woman in the red dress feeding the pigeons. I've been waiting so long for someone who could see the truth. David looked at his watch. It was 11:45. It was 11:45. He walked to the town square, his heart pounding with anticipation and fear. At exactly noon, he saw her. A woman in a red Victorian dress, sitting on a bench and feeding pigeons from a small bag. She looked up as he approached. Her eyes were filled with hope and desperation. You can see me, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I can see you, see me, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I can see you, Evelyn. I read your journal. I understand what's happening here. Tears streamed down her face. We've been trapped for so long. The same day, the same conversations, the same events. Only a few of us remember. The rest just live each cycle thinking it's their first time. David sat down beside her on the bench. How did this happen? Why is the town stuck in a loop? Why is the town stuck in a loop? Evelyn looked toward the old clock tower that dominated the town square. It happened during the dedication ceremony for that clock tower, October 13th, 1878. The town gathered to celebrate, but something went wrong. A terrible accident during the ceremony. Everyone died, David. The entire town. David felt a chill run down his spine. But people are still here. I'm here. We're echoes, Evelyn explained, shadows of what was. A town was rebuilt on the same spot, and new people came. But they became part of the loop, too. Anyone who stays in Riverside long enough becomes trapped in the cycle. Your father knew. He tried to warn you, but he ran out of time. My father knew about this. Evelyn nodded. He was like you, able to see the truth. He spent years trying to find a way to break the cycle. That's why he became the librarian, to have access to all the town's records. He hid clues for you in the archives. David thought about all the late nights his father had spent in the library, all the research projects that seemed to have no purpose. What kind of clues? The journal was just the beginning. There are others who remember, scattered throughout the town. We've been leaving messages for each other, trying to piece together what happened that day. Your father found most of the truth, but he died before he could act on it. Died. Or was he removed because he got too close? Evelyn's silence was answer enough. What do I need to do? David asked. The clock tower is the key. Something is buried beneath it, something that anchors us to this endless cycle. If we can destroy it, we might be able to break free. But it has to be done at the exact moment the loop resets, at midnight on October 13th. David looked at the calendar on his phone. October 13th was tomorrow night. Will you help us, David? Will you finish what your father started? David looked around the town square, seeing it with new eyes. The people walking by, going about their daily routines, had no idea they were trapped in an endless repetition. Mrs. Patterson was arranging flowers in her shop window, just as she had done every day for over a century. Dr. Morrison was walking to his office, adjusting his glasses in that familiar gesture. What happens if we succeed? What happens if we succeed? What happens to everyone? I don't know, Evelyn admitted. Maybe we'll finally be able to rest. Maybe we'll move on to whatever comes next. Or maybe we'll simply cease to exist. But anything is better than this eternal prison. David made his decision. Tell me what I need to do. The next night, David met Evelyn and 3 other townspeople who remembered the truth. They gathered in the basement of the clock tower, where David's father had discovered a hidden chamber containing the remains of the original ceremony. In the center of the chamber sat an ornate wooden box, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the lamplight. Inside the box was a pocket watch, its hands frozen at the moment of the original disaster. This is what's keeping us trapped, Evelyn explained. Time stopped at the moment of the accident, and we've been living in that frozen moment ever since. As midnight approached, David could feel the weight of the decision before him. If he destroyed the watch, he might free the trapped souls of Riverside. But he would also be destroying the only home he had ever known. At exactly midnight, as the clock tower began to chime, David raised a hammer and brought it down on the pocket watch. The world exploded in light and sound. David felt himself being pulled apart and put back together again. The last thing he heard was Evelyn's voice, filled with gratitude and peace. Thank you, David. Thank you for setting us free. When David woke up, he was lying in a field outside of town. Riverside was gone. In its place was an empty valley, peaceful and quiet. The only sign that a town had ever existed, there was a single gravestone, marking the mass grave of those who had died in the clock tower accident over a century ago. David left that place and never returned. He moved to a new city, found a new job, and tried to build a new life. But sometimes, on quiet nights, he could swear he heard the sound of a clock tower chiming in the distance, and he would smile, knowing that Evelyn and the others had finally found their rest. Story 7. The Collector's Last Acquisition. Our final story tonight takes us to the estate sale of renowned antiquarian Marcus Thornfield, where antique dealer Rebecca Stone discovered that some collections are never meant to be broken up. Rebecca had been dealing in antiques for 15 years, and she had developed a reputation for finding hidden treasures in estate sales and auctions. And she heard that the estate of Marcus Thornfield was being liquidated. She knew she had to attend. Thornfield had been a legendary collector, known for acquiring rare and unusual items from around the world. The Thornfield Mansion was a Gothic revival masterpiece, filled with artifacts spanning centuries and continents. There were medieval weapons, ancient pottery, Victorian furniture, and curiosities that Rebecca couldn't even identify. But what caught her attention was a small, unassuming wooden box sitting on a side table in the library. The box was made of dark wood, possibly ebony, with intricate carvings covering every surface. The carvings depicted scenes of daily life from various cultures and time periods. Egyptian hieroglyphs flowed into Celtic knots, which transformed into Asian dragons, which became Native American symbols. It was as if the entire history of human civilization had been compressed into the surface of this single box. Rebecca asked the estate manager about the box, but he had no information about it. It wasn't listed in Thornfield's catalog, and there was no documentation about where it had come from or what it contained. The asking price was modest, so Rebecca purchased it without hesitation. Back at her shop, Rebecca examined the box more closely. It was heavier than it looked, and she could hear something shifting inside when she moved it, but she couldn't find any obvious way to open it. There was no visible latch, keyhole, or hinge. The carvings seemed to be the only feature, flowing seamlessly around the entire surface. Rebecca spent hours studying the carvings, trying to find a pattern or clue that might reveal how to open the box. As she traced the symbols with her finger, she began to notice that they seemed to tell a story. The Egyptian section showed the construction of pyramids. The Celtic portion depicted ancient rituals. The Asian dragons represented the rise and fall of dynasties. But there was something disturbing about the story the carvings told. Each civilization depicted seemed to end in the same way, with figures fleeing in terror from a dark, shapeless mass that consumed everything in its path. That night, Rebecca took the box home, determined to solve its mystery. She set it on her kitchen table and continued studying the carvings by lamplight. As she traced the symbols, she began to feel a strange warmth emanating from the wood, as if something inside was responding to her touch. Suddenly, one of the carvings shifted. A small Egyptian ankh rotated 90 degrees, revealing a hidden depression beneath. Rebecca pressed it, and another symbol moved. This time, a Celtic spiral. She realized that the carvings were a puzzle, and she had to activate them in the correct sequence to open the box. It took her 3 hours, but finally, she heard a soft click. The top of the box lifted slightly, revealing a thin line of golden light around the edges. Rebecca hesitated, remembering the disturbing images carved into the wood. But curiosity won out, and she slowly opened the box. Inside was a collection of small objects, each one beautiful and unique. There was a jade figurine from ancient China, a golden scarab from Egypt, a crystal pendant from medieval Europe, and dozens of other artifacts from cultures around the world. Each piece seemed to glow with its own inner light, and Rebecca could feel a strange energy radiating from them. But as she reached for one of the objects, a small Mayan jade mask, she heard a voice. "Finally, someone has opened my collection." Rebecca spun around, but her kitchen was empty. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who's there?" "I am Marcus Thornfield, or rather, I was. I have been waiting for someone worthy to inherit my life's work." Rebecca looked at the box with new understanding. "You're trapped in there? You're trapped in there, aren't you?" "Not trapped, my dear. preserved. Each of these artifacts contains a fragment of the civilization that created it. I have spent my entire existence collecting these pieces, preserving the essence of human history. But I am old, and I need someone to continue my work. Rebecca examined the artifacts more closely. Now she could see that each one contained swirling patterns of light, like tiny galaxies trapped in stone and metal. What happened to the civilizations? The carvings show them being destroyed by something dark. Thornfield's voice grew sad. Time, my dear. Time is the great destroyer. Civilizations rise and fall, cultures are forgotten, knowledge is lost. But these artifacts preserve what was. They contain the memories, the dreams, the very souls of the people who created them. And you want me to continue collecting them? I want you to understand what you have inherited. This box is not just a container, it is a repository of human experience. Every artifact you add to the collection preserves another piece of our shared history. But be warned, the responsibility is great. Once you accept this role, you become the guardian of all human memory. Rebecca looked at the glowing artifacts, feeling their pull. She could sense the stories they contained, the lives they represented. It was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. What if I refuse? Then the collection will find another guardian. It always does. But I sense in you a kindred spirit, someone who understands the value of preserving the past. Rebecca thought about her life as an antique dealer, her passion for history and forgotten treasures. In many ways, she had been preparing for this moment her entire career. If I accept what happens to you, I will finally be able to rest. My consciousness will join the collection, becoming part of the eternal record of human experience. It is not death, but transformation. Rebecca made her decision. She reached into the box and picked up the jade mask. The moment her fingers touched it, she was flooded with visions of ancient Mayan cities, of priests and kings, of knowledge and wisdom that had been lost for centuries. I accept. The box began to glow brighter, and Rebecca felt a change beginning within her. She could sense the location of other artifacts around the world, calling to her to be preserved. She understood now that her life's work was just beginning. Thank you. The collection is in good hands. Rebecca felt his presence fade away, joining the countless other souls preserved within the artifacts.
She was alone now, but not truly alone. She was the guardian of human memory, the keeper of civilization's treasures. From that day forward, Rebecca's antique shop became something more. Collectors and historians from around the world began seeking her out, drawn by rumors of her incredible finds. She would travel to remote locations, following the pull of artifacts that needed to be preserved. And late at night, when the shop was closed and the world was quiet, Rebecca would open the box and commune with the voices of the past. She would listen to their stories, learn from their wisdom, and ensure that their memories would never be forgotten. The collection grew, and with it, Rebecca's understanding of her role as guardian. She was no longer just an antique dealer. She was the keeper of human history, the protector of civilization's soul. And someday, when her time came, she would find another worthy guardian to continue the work. Because some collections are too important to ever be broken up, and some stories are too precious to ever be lost. And those, dear listeners, are tonight's 7 echoes from the darkness. 7 souls who discovered that some responsibilities transcend death, some promises echo through eternity. Some truths are too important to remain hidden. From Sarah's vigil in the hospital to Rebecca's guardianship of human memory, each story reminds us that we are all connected by invisible threads of love, duty, and shared experience. The boundaries between life and death, past and present, are far more fragile than we imagine.
Have you ever encountered a presence that couldn't be explained? A moment where the veil between worlds seemed paper thin. A responsibility that felt larger than yourself. I would love to hear your stories. I would love to hear your stories. Send them to me, and your tale might become our next Midnight Echo. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows. Subscribe to Midnight Echoes for more stories that blur the line between dreams and nightmares, between the living and the dead, between what we know and what we fear to discover. And remember, in the quiet hours of the night, when the world sleeps and shadows dance, the echoes of midnight are always listening. Some stories never end, some voices never fade, and some truths wait patiently in the darkness for someone brave enough to hear them. Sweet dreams, if you can. Until we meet again in the space between sleeping and waking, where all the best stories live.